Welcome everybody to our first CCNB seminar in this year. So happy New Year to all of you. It's an unbelievable pleasure to welcome Marcel Brass today as our speaker. So very briefly about him. He actually studied psychology. We're very proud of that here at the FU. Yeah, it's not that long time ago. And then he moved on, actually, and also like a bit of philosophy, as he mentioned earlier. And then from there, he moved on for his PhD to the Max Planck Institute for Psychology in Munich, and worked there with Wolfgang Prinz. And I guess he enjoyed working at the Max Planck Institute a lot, yeah. But then he moved on further, working at the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive and Brain Science. Was established, I think, in the mid of the 90s in Leipzig, working there together with von Cramont, and also got their Heisenberg professorship, and then went on to place to got his own share in general psychology at Ghent from 2010 to 2020. And now we are extremely pleased that he joined us here in Berlin. He got an Einstein professorship at the Humboldt University and also the Berlin School of Math and Brain. So I think for the cognitive neuroscience community here in Berlin, it's a really huge achievement having him now here. So Marcel is one of the really leading people worldwide in cognitive neuroscience, especially like in action and cognitive control, and also like a social neuroscience. So I'm looking very much forward to your talk today, and I'm very pleased that you are here and have visited us today here at the FU. Oh, Marcel.
So first of all, Felix, thanks a lot for this introduction. So maybe I won't give the talk after this introduction. It can be only a disappointment, I'm afraid. Yeah, it's really nice for me to be here back. I think I have only been once or twice again at the FU. So I studied here not long ago, only 25 years ago, in the 90s. And ever since, I think the place has really changed dramatically in a way. I mean, cognitive neuroscience, at least here in Berlin, didn't exist at this time, in my opinion. And now it's really impressive to see what kind of institutions you can find here in Berlin, in particular at the FU Berlin. So that's really very exciting, and that is also one of the reasons why I thought it might be interesting to come back to Berlin. And of course, the city is very interesting. So I'm working, as Felix already said, I'm working at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. I'm affiliated with the psychology department. I'm also doing work in the cluster Science of Intelligence. That's also a very interesting research environment, but I'm also still affiliated with the Department of Experimental Psychology at Ghent University in Belgium. Most of the stuff that I will present today is related to my work in Ghent. But what I will do today is give you a kind of overview of more or less 25 years of research on imitation, automatic imitation, action observation that started with my PhD and then developed in different directions. So there will be a little bit of theory in the beginning. This is the background I got from Munich, from Wolfgang Prinz, the common coding theory, idiomotive theory. Then I will describe some behavioral studies that we did, and in the end I will also talk a little bit about neuroimaging work on this topic. And yeah, let's see. So if you have questions, you can interrupt me if you want. Yeah, we can see how this develops. Okay, so first, a little bit of theory. So the classical perspective on the relationship of perception and action was the following. So there is a kind of perceptual system. This is a figure by Descartes. So information enter via this afferent system. Then there is a kind of transformation mechanism here, which you could call cognition. And then you have action, the kind of outflowing information into the world. Now, my PhD supervisor, Wolfgang Prinz, always compared that to a toilet flushing. So you have this input, someone pressing the lever, then you have this very complicated mechanism that is doing something, transforming the lever movement into the outflow of the water, which is in principle the afferent information. What is happening here is not really clear. If you ever try to repair toilet flushing, you will see it's quite complicated, quite a complicated mechanism. So this in-between thing was always a little bit mysterious. But there is an alternative perspective on that. And this alternative perspective assumes that perception and action are not really two independent systems, but that at one level, there is a kind of shared representational overlap between the two systems. And I will explain that in more detail in a minute. Now, this view of shared representations of perception and action has gained a lot of support in the last 25 years. And I will go briefly through this support and then explain a little bit the theoretical ideas that we have, how this overlap occurs. So first of all, you all have heard about these neurons, so-called mirror neurons in the ventral premotor cortex and the parietal cortex of the macaque monkey, neurons that are active when the monkey observes and executes a specific behavior. In a way, you could argue that these kind of neurons are kind of neural correlate of this overlap between perception and action, because these are not really action neurons, and they are not really perception neurons. They are in principle coding this overlap. Then following this observation, there is also a lot of cognitive neuroscience research showing that perception and action are not really separate. So this research showed that when you observe behavior, this activates brain areas that are also strongly involved in the execution of behavior or in motor preparation. So also on the neural level, on the systems level, you have an overlap between perceptual events, in particular when you observe action, and motor events when you prepare these actions. Then there is also an interesting social psychological literature emphasizing this overlap between perception and action. And one of the most described phenomena is the so-called chameleon effect. And I think everybody knows this effect. You are in a conversation with someone, and this person is, for example, touching her face, and suddenly you find yourself doing the same thing. So you seem to automatically imitate what the other person is doing. When you become aware of it, it's a little bit embarrassing. You start to stop that. So it's not a conscious thing, it's something that is happening more or less automatically in a way. So observing somebody acting in specific situations leads to direct imitation of the same behavior. And then there is also some clinical research, clinical neuropsychological research on this phenomena. In the 80s, Lermite, a French neurologist, described the phenomenon that he called imitative behavior. So these patients who usually had prefrontal brain damage overtly imitated other people without really seeing why this was a problem. And Lermite described some really weird anecdotes, what these patients were doing. Afterwards, it was a little bit called into question how prevalent this neuropsychological syndrome really is in prefrontal patients. But in general, there are a number of neuropsychological phenomena where people tend to imitate observed behavior. Now, there is a lot of evidence from different domains that perception and action is not independent and that there is some overlap. But how does this overlap develops? And there are some very old theories how that might happen. And one of these ideas, which was formulated by Piaget, but goes back to the 19th century, is this idea of circular reactions. So if you observe a baby, like this one here, this baby executes hand movements relatively simple hand movements and observes these movements as if somebody else would do that. Very interesting. So the idea is that this action observation and execution, so she repeats the movements that she is doing, is based on a simple associative mechanism. So you have some motor commands, maybe some random motor activity in the motor cortex of this baby that leads to specific sensory consequences. For example, observing yourself moving the hand, which become associated with the motor command because executing the movement leads to the sensory consequence, which then becomes associated with the motor command. And now observing your own sensory consequence triggers the motor command again, which leads to the sensory consequence, which triggers the motor command again. And in principle, you would have a kind of infinite kind of repetition, self-imitation that wouldn't stop until the attention is drawn away from the movement, and then this would stop. And now, if you have such a mechanism, it's also very plausible while observing somebody else automatically activates this motor command in the observer in a way, because you have this association between action observation and the motor commands. Now, observing somebody else also triggers this association because seeing somebody else moving the hand looks quite similar to yourself moving the hand, and that then triggers the motor command. So this is in principle a very simple associative learning interpretation of mirror neurons, if you want so. This was put forward by Celia Hayes very prominently. She didn't really make friends in this mirror neuron community because they didn't like that she came up with such a very low-level interpretation of these findings. Okay. Now, I think this is a very interesting explanation of this kind of shared representation of perception and action. But I think that it is only half of the story, because I think that what is happening is a little bit more complicated. And this is what I would want to explain to you. This is the idiomotive principle, which adds a specific, an additional layer to this association between perceived and executed action. And I put a brain in the background. So this is my first reference to the brain today. We know that makes the whole story a little bit more plausible. But I mean, there is also a little bit of anatomical correlate here. So you have the motor command, presumably in the primary motor system, primary motor cortex, that leads to a movement, and this movement has sensory consequences. Of course, you see your hand moving, you also feel your hand moving, you have tactile proprioceptive information. So you perceive this. So you have a visual representation, for example, of your movement, and then after a while, an association is formed between this visual representation of the movement and the motor command. So you have a simple association of that. And in principle, that would already be sufficient to trigger the motor command when you observe it in somebody else. Now, idiomotive theory assumes that what is happening after a while is that you start to form an anticipation of the sensory consequences of the movement, which is a kind of motor image. Because you know when you move your hand, it will lead to a specific visual impression, a specific sensory impression. You start to anticipate the sensory consequences of your movement, and this anticipation is used to control your behavior. Because now when you want to move your hand, you in principle only have to imagine to move your hand, and that is associated with the motor command. So in principle, you can voluntarily control your movements by anticipating their sensory consequences. This is the idea of idiomotor theory. As I said, it's 150 years old. The idea is that the idio part, leads to an activation of a motor response. Now, if you assume such a mechanism, and this was nicely formulated in the 70s by Anthony Greenwald, it's also clear why observing a movement leads to an activation of the motor command. So now, first of all, when you intend to execute the movement, you activate this motor representation, which is associated with the motor command. But also, when you observe a movement, it activates the sensory representation, which via similarity activates the motor representation of the movement, which is associated with the motor command. So the advantage of this additional representation is the following. First of all, you can take the motor execution offline. You can imagine to move without moving. That is one huge advantage of this kind of separation, of this direct association between the visual and motor via this kind of representation. And also, of course, you can, if you observe somebody, this might activate this motor representation, but that doesn't have to necessarily lead to the execution of the motor response. You can inhibit this at this level here. Okay. To tease apart these two theories, the associative learning theory and the idiomotor approach, is not so easy. It's quite tricky. I think it hasn't been, there is no clear evidence for either, I would say, or that they can be separated. Okay, now how can we investigate the influence of action observation on action execution? And here, this is research that I developed during my PhD in the late 90s. So the basic idea is of idiomotor theory that you use an internal representation of the sensory consequences of the movement to control your movement. Now let's assume at the same time you observe somebody else moving the hand. You want to lift your middle finger and you observe somebody lifting the middle finger. So then your motor intention and the externally triggered motor representation are identical. So you expect that it is easier to execute the action because what you observe in the environment facilitates what you have to do. Okay, so it's easy to execute the action. Now, in the situation where you intend a specific movement, for example, you want to lift your middle finger and you see an index finger movement, the situation is different. So you activate the motor representation for the middle finger movement, but you observe an index finger movement which activates the motor representation of the index finger movement. So you have two motor representations active at the same time, which causes interference, and you have to resolve this interference to execute the movement in a way. So the basic idea is that in this interference situation, you have competition between your motor intention and the externally triggered motor representation, and you have to resolve this competition in order to execute the correct response. And this is exactly the paradigm that I developed to investigate this. So in this paradigm, you see a hand on the computer screen. You have an imperative stimulus, namely a number, which could be a 1 or a 2. If you see a 1, you have to lift your index finger. If you see a 2, you have to lift your middle finger. And while you are responding to this imperative stimulus, you see a congruent movement on the computer screen. So you have to lift your middle finger here and you see a middle finger movement, or you see an incongruent movement. So you have to lift your middle finger, but you see an index finger movement. So here you have this competition between the externally triggered motor representation and your motor intention. And in order to give you a little bit more plastic representation of that, I have an audience participation part. This is the experiment. So the idea is put your hand on the table or wherever, and if you see a 1, lift your index finger. If you see a 2, lift your middle finger. Okay, here we go. Yeah. That was too fast. Who lifted the middle finger? Okay, you people, the older one. Brief on control is already a little bit compromised. In principle, it should start with with a few initial trials where you see congruent conditions. This was a little bit faster. So in principle, if you lifted your middle finger, you imitated the movement, even though the instruction was to lift your index finger. This happens sometimes in the beginning of the experiment. People make errors after that while they don't really make errors anymore. But what you find very consistently, almost in every participants, not only the older ones, is this interference effect. So participants are faster when they see a congruent movement compared to the situation where they see an incongruent movement. And the baseline condition where you don't see any movement at all usually lies in between. So this experimental setup has now been replicated a lot of times, and it has been decomposed what the spatial compatibility component is to that. So it has really excessively been investigated. It's quite, luckily, a reliable phenomenon. So it's very easy to replicate even with small participant numbers. Recently, PhD and then postdoc of mine did a meta-analysis on this. And nowadays, a lot of factors have been investigated that influence or do not influence this automatic imitation effect. But as I said, there is now a relatively large literature on it. Now, the interesting thing is that one thing, at least to our knowledge, that hasn't been investigated is what happens if you are not in this kind of dyadic situation where you act and you see somebody else acting, but in a situation where you are in a group of people, like here. So, interestingly, there are a number of phenomena that seem to be quite forceful. When you see, for example, people dancing in this stadium, in a football stadium, if people start to clap or do this Mexican wave, that seem to affect people very strongly emotionally, but also presumably on the motor level. So we were wondering, and this is a research line I developed together with a master student at that time, then PhD, and then postdoc, Emil Krakow, quite a while ago. We were wondering, how do people represent multiple actions and multiple agents in their motor system? And interestingly, that, to our knowledge, at least in this domain, hasn't been investigated so far. And I would like to show you a brief video that I like a lot. It's from YouTube and might wake you up if you fall asleep after the theoretical introduction, which illustrates, in my opinion, very nicely this kind of phenomenon. Okay, up again. So there are two types of situations that are nicely depicted in this video. Namely a situation where all the four agents are doing the same thing. So in one question that we were interested in is, how do you represent multiple agents that are doing the same thing? And how does it affect our motor system? Does it lead to a stronger activation of our motor system? That is one question we were interested in. And the second question is, what happens if you see people doing different things? Can we represent multiple actions in our motor system? Okay. Unfortunately, our experiments are usually not that nice and funny, so we use very simple stimuli usually to test this. So what we did was we had in principle an extension of this automatic imitation paradigm I showed you in the beginning, but now with multiple agents in a way. So now you have two hands on the computer screen. Participants only respond with one hand, by the way, with their right hand. And there are a number of situations. Again, participants respond to the imperative cue, which is either the P, which is the pinky finger, or a W, which is the vice finger, which is Dutch for the other way around. Vice finger is index finger, and pinky finger is a small finger in a way. So again, participants respond to this imperative cue while observing hands on the computer screen that are executing actions. And now you have a number of situations. First of all, you have the situation where you only see the imperative cue and you have to respond to this imperative cue, and the hands on the computer screen do not move. Then you have the situation where one hand on the computer screen responds congruently to your movement. So you have to extend the pinky finger and you see the pinky finger movement of one hand. This is equivalent to the situation I showed you in the beginning. Then you have the situation where one movement is incongruent. Again, the incongruent condition of the previous paradigm, you have to extend your pinky finger, for example, and you see an index finger movement of one hand. And then you have the more complicated situation. So you see two congruent movements on the computer screen here. And the interesting situation is when you see one congruent and one incongruent. So you have to extend your pinky finger, for example. You see one hand extending the pinky finger and the other hand extending the index finger. Okay. The first question that we wanted to investigate was whether the effect of movement observation is stronger when you see two compared to only one movement. So the straightforward comparison was simply to see what happens when you compare these two congruent or incongruent movements with a situation where you see only one congruent or incongruent movement. And what we found was that this is when you see only one finger moving, and this is when you see two finger movings. And what you can see is that both in reaction time and in errors, the effect is larger for two movements compared to one movement. And you see that in reaction time and errors. So it looks as if this effect, this motor resonance effect in behavior becomes stronger when you see two people executing the action. Now, the question is, what happens if you increase the number of agents that are executing the action? If you see 100, will the interference effect get larger and larger? And interestingly, there is an old social psychological experiment that has investigated something similar, an experiment by Stanley Milgram, who put a number of people on the street in New York, Confederates, and they were looking up to the, I don't know, 6th floor of the building. And then he tested how many people stopped and looked up as well. And what he found was that depending on how many Confederates looked up, the number of people who stopped increased linearly, and the number of people who also looked up increased until a specific number of Confederates, and then there was a leveling out. We did a very similar experiment, but with our hand stimuli, and found a very interesting and similar result. So that to a specific degree, if you see more and more hands moving, you find a larger congruency effect, which then at one point levels out. So in principle, in this experimental setting, we replicated these findings to some degree. Now, more recently, we wanted to replicate this kind of Milgram experiments in a more ecologically valid setting. So we came up with a kind of VR version of this. So participants are in a VR world. They are standing with a number of agents, and if they hear a shot, they have to look left. And if they hear glass breaking, they have to look right. And then you have these agents here standing in front of them that either do the congruent or the incongruent thing. And we write the number of agents that were executing this action. And interestingly, so this is the experimental design. We had a kind of forced choice condition where an imperative cue told them to look left or right, and then we had congruent or incongruent trials. We also had a condition, the free choice condition, where participants could freely choose which action to execute. And then as dependent measures in the forced choice condition, we had reaction time, partial errors, where they looked first in one direction and then in the other, and real errors, where they really looked in the wrong direction. And in the free choice condition, we had reaction time, partial choices, where they looked in one direction and then changed their opinion and looked in the other direction, and the proportion of following, so to say. And what we found was very similar to the original Milgram experiment. First of all, in the forced choice condition, we found the interaction of number of agent and congruency in reaction times. We found that participants made partial errors in the incongruent condition. They first looked in the wrong direction and then changed their mind and looked in the right direction. This effect leveled out, like in the Milgram experiment, and also the number of errors interacted with the number of observed agents in a way. And in the free choice condition, we also show this reaction time effect. Interestingly, also in the free choice condition, participants sometimes look in one direction and then change their mind and look into another direction, even though they can choose themselves. And they do that more often when the group looks in the left direction. They first look into the left direction and then change their mind. And the proportion of following the group increases with the number of agents in the group that execute the action. So what we concluded from that was that there is a very strong drive to follow the group, to imitate the group, and this can be overridden sometimes either by external instruction or by intentions of participants. But first of all, seeing more agents moving leads to a very strong tendency to follow this movement. Okay, now the second question that we were interested in is, can we simulate different actions at the same time? So can we represent two movements at the same time? And because of the time, I will directly go to the imaging data where we have addressed this question more directly, because the behavioral data are a little bit tricky in this respect. Because if you look at the situation where one person is doing a congruent movement and the other person is doing an incongruent movement, what you would expect if people would, in principle, simulate both movements is that the interference effect disappears, because congruent movement should lead to a facilitation and incongruent movement to interference, so this should cancel each other out. So it's a little bit tricky to investigate that with reaction time. This is exactly what we found, but I will come back to that in a minute when I discuss the imaging data. So now we did this series of behavioral experiments. We also did a TMS study in which we could show that motor facilitation by action observation is stronger when you observe multiple agents executing this action. So the motor system is more strongly activated. But we also wanted to see, first of all, is the mirror system or areas that have been related to this mirror system involved in this mechanism, or is it maybe only a perceptual mechanism? And also we wanted to look at the representational level and see whether you can represent different movements at the same time. Okay. Now, the experimental design of this imaging study is relatively simple. So it was in principle a passive observation condition. So participants in the experimental condition did not really have to execute movement. They were only observing movements. And we had a kind of catch-try condition where there was a flickering in the movement so that people really attended the movement and really watched what was happening on the screen. And we had a number of conditions very similar to the conditions I described in the other experiment. So we had a one movement condition we had two identical movements, then a condition with two different movements, and a no movement condition. Furthermore, we had a motor localizer task where participants had to simply squeeze the ball or watch a blank screen, more or less. And this we did to localize areas that are both active during action observation and action execution, so to localize the mirror system, so to say. I will come back to that in a minute. And this is how the stimuli look like. So you had a repetition of three movements in a row. Now, first of all, we did univariate analysis, and the first question that we were interested in was the mirror system, so to say, most strongly activated when you see two different movements compared to only one movement. And we localized these mirror areas by looking at the overlap of the execution condition with a pure movement observation condition. So, and we found two areas, one in the premotor cortex and one in the parietal cortex, that were active both during action observation and action execution. And we used these areas of region of interest and then looked at the different conditions. And interestingly, what we found was that indeed activation in these areas were stronger when participants observed two hand moving compared to one hand moving only. We also always looked at the visual cortex, where the effect is, of course, very strong, because, of course, you see more visually happening on the screen in the two movement condition compared to the one movement condition. But interestingly, also in these motor preparation area or mirror areas, you find a strong activation for the two movement compared to the one movement condition. Now, the other question that we wanted to address with this imaging experiment was whether people are able to represent two movements at the same time in their motor system. And in order to address this question, we used a different way to analyze the imaging data, namely multivariate analysis technique. Now, coming back to my theory, the basic idea of this idiomotive theory is that if you see two people moving the hand or two hands executing different movements, this should lead to an activation of two motor representations at the same time. So in principle, you should find a kind of overlap with a situation where only one of this movement is happening or the other movement is happening in a way, because this one movement condition should activate one of these two motor representations that is activated by the two movement condition. But you should find lesser overlap with a condition where a different movement is happening that is not part of these two simultaneous movements. So that is the basic logic of the fMRI analysis that we carried out. And the fMRI analysis we carried out was a representational similarity analysis. And I will briefly explain to those of you who don't know this analysis. So basic idea is that in contrast to classical univariate analysis, you look at the pattern of brain activation. And what you are doing is you in principle compare the pattern of activation across conditions. You know, when you measure the fMRI signal, you measure thousands of voxels. So in principle, you have thousands of measurement points. And in principle, you can look at the pattern and see how similar it is between conditions. Now, this is a kind of pet model of this, where you have only 4 voxels. So let's assume you have condition A, where these 2 voxels are active, and condition B, where these 2 voxels are active. Now you can compute the correlation between these 2 variables, and then you should find a high correlation. Compared to this situation where the representation of the neural level is different. So let's assume in this condition, these 2 voxels are active, and in the other condition, the other two voxels are active. Here, you would find a very low correlation. Okay, now we can use this logic to compare the situation where you see two movements on the computer screen with a situation where you only see one movement on the computer screen. So, and this movement is either one of these movements like here, or it's a different movement. Now, the basic idea would be that if you represent both movements, then the similarity between these two movement conditions, the neural activity that you find for these two movement conditions, should be relatively high when you see one of these two movements that are part of the two movement situation. And it should be low for the situation where you see a third movement that is not part of these two. So in principle, you are looking at the relative correlation of conditions where you see two movements and then one movement, and you correlate the one movement conditions where the one movement is part of the two movement part with a situation where the one movement is not part of the two movement situation. And this is exactly what we did. And what we found was, first of all, again, we have these areas. We have the visual cortex that we always investigated, and then we have these mirror areas, areas that are active both during action observation and action execution. And what we found was that the correlation was higher in the condition where you saw a movement that was part of the two movement situation. Here, movement overlap with A or overlap with B, compared to a situation where there was no overlap between the observed movement and the two movement situation. So in principle, this supported our hypothesis that at least to some degree, people seem to represent both of the movements when they see two movements at the same time. I hope this logic became clear. Now, we did another analysis that we fortunately pre-registered, because I think it's the logic of it isn't necessarily clear if you don't assume this kind of strong idiomotor theory assumptions. So the basic idea is what happens when you compare a situation where you see two different movements with a situation where you see two times the same movement. Now, again, to our theory, you have one movement activated by observation, the other movement activated by observation. Now the idea is that in principle, you should have a kind of response conflict by observation. So two actions are activated in your motor system, and that should trigger in principle response competition without you having to do anything. So it's a kind of response conflict by observation. So our hypothesis was that when people see two different movements, and if we compare it with a situation where they see two times the same movement, we should find brain activation that is related to response competition, even though participants did not have to respond to the movements. So what we did was we localized an area that is related to response competition. We did that via small meta-analysis in neurothin. So we localized this area, and then we were comparing the condition. So, and the area is the ACC, which is not really surprising. So it's very well known that this area is involved in response competition. It's also involved in a number of other stuff, by the way, but at least I think it's fair to say that it's involved in response competition. And then we looked at the comparison between the two different movement and two same movement condition in our data. And what we found was that in the current study, we found a significant overlap between the area that is involved in response competition and the area that we found for this contract. This is kind of indirect evidence. I mean, people would say it's reverse inference in a way, because we use the location of a brain area to infer a specific cognitive function. But I think, in my opinion, it's completely legitimate if you a priori hypothesis this kind of relationship. So this seems to indicate that when people are seeing two movements, this induces a kind of response conflict by observation in the observer. We also have done now behavioral studies where we use behavioral indices of response conflict, and we could also show that you find this kind of response conflict by observation in behavior as well. Okay, to summarize the findings, observing one action executed by multiple agents leads to stronger mirroring than observing a single agent executed the action. The effect of multiple agents seems to follow an asymptotic pattern. So the effect becomes stronger for a number of agents, but then at one point it levels out. We seem to be able to mirror different actions at the same time. So it seemed to be possible to represent two different movements at the same time in our ledger system. And this is quite interesting, because if we want to use this system to also model social interaction, then it's of course very crucial that we can not only represent one movement in the system, but also more than one movement. But we didn't test that for 3 or 4 or 5 movements, by the way. And observing different actions seem to induce response conflict in the observer, simply by observation, without you having to do anything. And this is very congruent with the idea that simply by observing a movement, a motor representation is activated, and therefore this motor representation can compete if they differ, so to say. And I would like to finish my presentation with first acknowledging the contribution of Emil Krakow, who was a master student and PhD student, and then the postdoc, who did almost all of this work. I mean, he is really incredible. I mean, I came up with the idea and he developed a research program from it. That's really impressive. And then, of course, I would also acknowledge all the funding agencies for supporting this research. And I would like to thank you for your attention.